Well, hello. It's good to see you today. Thanks for tuning in. Today is Wednesday, May the 12th, and we're reading today from James chapter 3. James chapter 3. But before we get into James 3, let me talk a little bit about the book of James as a whole, and specifically as it relates to our chronological reading schedule. I want to make sure that I clarify something that might have been a little bit misleading on the chronological reading plan that I put together. Last Friday, we read Acts chapter 12. And in Acts 12, you have the narrative of James, one of the apostles, who was taken into custody by Herod and was killed. And then after we finished reading Acts 12 last Friday, we started on Monday of this week reading the book of James. And we're in the book of James all this week. But I want to make sure you understand that the James who was killed in Acts 12 is not the same James who wrote the book that we're reading this week. In Acts 12, that was James the Apostle. Here, in this week's reading, we're reading from the book of James. This is James, the Lord's brother, Jesus' brother. The other James from Acts 12 was the brother of John the Apostle, James and John. Those two were brothers. This book is written by Jesus' brother, James. It's two different men. And I wanted to make sure that you understand that because of the placement in our chronological reading. You might have thought, hey, we just read this event about James dying in Acts 12, and now we're reading the book of James. You might have thought that they were the same person, but it's not. So the question then is, Ben, why did you put the book of James reading at the end of Acts 12 when James the Apostle was killed? Well, frankly, I didn't have a better place to put it. I didn't know where else to put it. I did have a reason for putting it where I did, but let me say a little bit more about that. You'll notice in the chronological reading schedule that of all of the epistles in the New Testament, this one in our schedule, James, is the first one given in the schedule. All of the other epistles come after this one. And that is because it is believed that the book of James, again, written by Jesus' half-brother, was probably one of, if not the earliest written epistle. And there's a lot within the epistle itself to commend that explanation. This book is particularly very Jewish in nature, and in the earliest days of the church was comprised of Jews. And so it is probably very likely that this really was one of the first epistles written, if not the first. And so that's part of the reason that I wanted to put it where I did in the schedule. But here's another reason. Acts chapter 13 really begins the focus on the work of the Apostle Paul. Acts 13 and Acts 14 is his first missionary journey. Chapter 15, at the end of the chapter, the second journey will begin, and on through the rest of the book of Acts, there's a great emphasis placed on the character and the travels of the Apostle Paul. Well, most of the New Testament epistles were written by the Apostle Paul. And so I wanted to put the book of James here between Acts 12 and Acts 13 because the emphasis will change to Paul in Acts 13. And since this is not one of Paul's epistles, and it is probably the earliest of the epistles, it seemed like a good idea to put the book of James into our reading schedule before we get to Acts 13 and the emphasis on Paul's work. So that gives you a little bit of understanding as to my thinking, why I put it where I did, okay? But I did want to clear up that confusion about the two men named James. Now, today's reading, James chapter 3, a very practical chapter, a very difficult chapter to apply. James 3 and verse 1. Let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we will incur a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. Controlling our speech. That can many times be a difficult thing to do. And there's a lot of reasons why it is a challenge for us to control our speech in the way that we should. And without going into those, because that's not really the emphasis here in James 3, James doesn't really pursue the why. He just talks about the what. He talks about the reality. It is difficult to control our tongues. James is going to talk about the challenge that comes with this and how difficult it is. But before he does that, we need to make sure we talk about verse 1 and how he begins this section. Don't let many of you become teachers, knowing that we will incur a stricter judgment. There is a greater responsibility that is placed upon those who teach and preach the Word of God. If we take it upon ourselves to fill that role of teacher or preacher, messenger of God's truth, then we do that with a very serious and very sober approach to the work that we're going to do. This is God's truth. Truth from the mind of the creator of the universe. And this is truth that has eternal consequences. And we really don't want to make a mistake with that. We're trying to help people navigate this world so that they can prepare for the next one. And we don't want to mislead. We don't want to guide people and take people down an incorrect path. And so we need to, as James says, we need to understand that there will be a greater judgment that is placed upon us. We will be held to a higher standard because we will be leading people either to God's truth or misleading them from God's truth to something other than God's truth. And so James says, understand that this is a very serious undertaking. But then he talks about the difficulty of controlling speech. Now, I think there are a number of applications to be made from this, even to those who are not teachers of the word, as James begins this chapter. He acknowledges in verse 2 the difficulty of controlling speech. He says, we all stumble in many ways. But if somebody is able to fully control what he says at all times, he is a perfect man, and he is able to bridle, control, discipline his entire body. I think James is saying in this chapter that controlling our speech is one of the more difficult things. And all of us, I think, in our experience, have probably found that to be true at one time or another. But now James goes into a number of illustrations that will show or prove his point. If we put bits into the horses' mouths so that they will obey us, we direct their entire body as well. Look at the ships. Though they are so great and are driven by strong winds, they are still directed by a very small rudder, wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. How can you control the direction of a horse as you're riding it? You take a small bit and you put it in its mouth. And that bit is connected to the reins, and you can steer and control that large, strong beast with a small bit. Or what about the big ships that are out on the sea? Ships that are very large in size, and it takes a great volume and strength of wind to push them in one direction or another. And yet, those ships can be controlled by this small rudder and a man standing with a wheel or someone who is somehow controlling that rudder. The point is, even these large things are controlled by very small things. And he says in verse 5, so also The tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. We've all seen these wildfires in various parts of the world, and they will start with a small spark. A small fire can quickly become a large fire, and it can spread to something that's beyond controlling if the conditions are right. And James says the tongue is the same way. And he continues this idea of the tongue being a fire. Verse 6, the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the entire body and sets on fire the course of our life, and it itself is set on fire by hell. The tongue has so much power with it, so much influence. We wield so much power with our speech, and that can be a good thing, or it can be a really bad thing. It can be a good thing as you think about those who do fill the capacity of good, responsible, knowledgeable, compassionate teachers, to connect it back to verse 1. When you have teachers who are truthful and knowledgeable and helpful in their presentation of truth, there's great power in the words that they're speaking. Not because it's their words, but because it's God's words that are coming through them. And it's tremendous to see how the gospel can change people. And the preaching and the proclamation of that gospel is a part of how the gospel changes people. People hear that truth, and then they take it in, they internalize it, and they begin to live it. And that's wonderful. But the converse is also very true, that there's great power in speech that comes from evil places as well. There's great harm that can come from a person's speech. James says that it can set on fire an entire world of iniquity, and he says that the tongue is set on fire itself from hell. That hell itself is responsible for the consequences of an evil tongue. Every species of beasts and birds, of reptiles and creatures of the sea, is tamed and has been tamed by the human race, but no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil and full of deadly poison. And with it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come both blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be this way. Our tongue has the capacity to do great good or great evil. And it's difficult to control it. It's difficult to tame it. But we must learn how to do it. We must discipline ourselves and discipline our speech and use our tongues in ways that, as Paul would say in the book of Ephesians and Colossians, that our speech would be always with grace, that it would be seasoned with salt, that our words would be those that edify others instead of tearing them down. James says it's difficult to do that, but it must be done. And if we're going to honor God with our lives, a big part of that is honoring Him with our speech. Thanks for reading along with me today. God bless you.